16th of June 1976, between 3,000 and 10,000 students marched peacefully to demonstrate and to protest against the government of the time's directive. The march was meant to culminate in a rally at Orlando Stadium. On their pathway, they were met by heavily armed police who fired tear gas and later live ammunition on the demonstrating students. This resulted in a widespread revolt that turned into an uprising against the government of the day. While the uprising began in Soweto, it spread across the country and it carried on until the following year. June 16th is the day when we remember those young fallen heroes in South Africa. Let us start by having a moment of silence. We remember them. His Excellency, the President of the Republic of South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa, has just addressed the nation today. And he says, just as the youth of 1976 worked hard for the demise of apartheid, so too must the youth of the current generation rise and be part of defeating poverty, defeating inequality, and defeating underdevelopment. Today is the National Youth Day in South Africa. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, you are welcome. My name is Pumela Salela, and I'm the UK country head for Brand South Africa. Brand South Africa is the official custodian of South Africa's nation brand. Our vision is a nation brand that inspires people and that is admired globally. Our mandate, and thus our primary objective, is to develop and to implement proactive and coordinated marketing, communication, and reputation management strategies for South Africa. Today is National Youth Day in South Africa. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area is a free trade area which commenced trade as of the 1st of January 2021. It was created by the African Continental Free Trade Agreement that was amongst 54 of the 55 African Union nations. The free trade area is the largest in the world in terms of the number of participating countries since the formation of the World Trade Organization. The general objective of this agreement is to create a single market, deepening the economic integration of the continent, establish a liberalized market through the multiple rounds of negotiations, aid in the movement of capital and people, facilitating investment, move towards the establishment of a future of continental customs union, to achieve sustainable and inclusive socio-economic development, gender equality, and structural transformations within member states, enhance competitiveness of member states within Africa and in the global market, encourage industrial development through the diversification and regional value chain management and development, agricultural development, and food security. And it is also aimed at resolving the challenges of multiple and overlapping memberships. So it is important, ladies and gentlemen, that we discuss the impact that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area will have on young people. And who best to do this than the young people themselves? More so because today we celebrate the youth. We commemorate rather the youth because we had young people who lost their lives during this time. And so the team that we have today, from the researcher to the moderator to the panelists to the technical team, are all young people. In South Africa, we consider you young, or we consider you youth if you are under the age of 35. or if I should say that if you are 35 years young. So let me tell you a bit about who is going to be joining us today. Starting off with the Brand South Africa team. We have Shamiso Nomsa Hlatshwayo, who's currently the Acting General Manager of Research at Brand South Africa. She has demonstrated her research expertise in market and competitive intelligence, in political risk and strategic stakeholder relations, and also project management. We also have Tandom Ketu, who is the face behind the digital platforms that you see in Brand South Africa, and she works with a team of other like-minded team players and individuals within the Brand South Africa digital team. We have Kaini Disepo, who's a youth and development expert whose work has seen him working with leading international organizations such as the United Nations, the GIZ, and the Inter-American Bank. Kaini is also the founder of Inspired Horizon, which is held as Botswana's first international university career fair. Jason Kitenge is an innovation strategist, and he's the founder of the Pamoja Network with extensive experience in the finance industry and the UK government's cabinet office. He's interested in leveraging technology for social impact, and is currently working at POCIT, a UK-based organization that aims to increase the presence of Black and people in the technology sector. Farai Mubaiwa is a founder of Africa Matters, which is an organization that empowers young Africans through leadership skills, capacity building, and community impact projects. In addition to this, Farai is also a partner management lead in the Youth Empowerment Service, the YES service, which is an organization that works in partnership with the South African government to mobilize policy change for youth job creation. Then we have Captain Londiwe Ngobo. Londiwe is Africa's first female dredge master with a host of global experience in the maritime sector. Affectionately known as the Black Mermaid, Londiwe has a passion for unlocking the ocean's economy and creating opportunities for young people to engage in the maritime industry. Our moderator, ladies and gentlemen, is Bunolo Madibe. She's a sustainability and social impact strategist. She has worked extensively across the nonprofit sector with a focus on youth and development. Bunolo's career has seen her working with leading corporate organizations to develop social impact initiatives that operate with sustainability in mind. Ladies and gentlemen, Nelson Mandela once said, "The youth of today are the leaders of tomorrow." So over to you, Bunolo, and the rest of your panelists.
Hey, my name is Catherine Constantinides. I'm a former Miss Earth South Africa, international climate activist and humanitarian. Youth Month is an opportunity for us to debate and discuss the challenges that we face as young people. However, it's also an opportunity for us to play our part and build the future that we believe is possible. I believe that no one makes a greater mistake than someone who does nothing because they can only do a little. It is an opportunity for us to believe in who we are. We as young people need to dream, and dream as big as possible, because it's only when we believe in what we want to achieve that will become our destiny. It is for us to write the history of the future storybooks that people will read. Be bold, be brave, aspire to inspire, play your part.
Thank you, Pumela, for the great introduction. We definitely have great minds in our midst. My name is Bunolo Madibe, and I will be your moderator for this panel today. With that in mind, I will jump straight into the conversation. Africa is the youngest continent in the world, with the median age of 9.8 years and 65% of the population being under the age of 25. However, many countries across the continent are plagued with youth unemployment, with a staggering 75% of youth in South Africa unemployed. Farai, this first question will be directed towards you. I would love to get your perspective on how you feel the African Continental Free Trade Agreement can help reduce youth unemployment, and what some of the main challenges have been, or some of the challenges you've noticed in your work have been in reducing unemployment.
Thanks so much for the question, and a very, very good afternoon to everyone who is watching. Really, really excited to commemorate Youth Day all together as we discuss such an important topic. Now, we understand that youth unemployment on the continent is a major, major issue. Youth unemployment, and in particular, if we look at unemployment as a whole, young people account for 60% of Africa's joblessness. And like you mentioned, Bonolo, within the South African context, our expanded definition of youth unemployment goes as far as 75%, highlighting that this also includes discouraged work seekers. Now, what we understand as the main issues for unemployment within the continent, and also from a South African perspective, they're multiple. One of them is that there are just not enough jobs in the market. That is the biggest one. The second one is that there are information asymmetries. So what young people think they are the skills and the knowledge they need to gain to be employed is not actually what the market is saying. And the third major issue that we face in terms of youth unemployment is definitely access. It's access to opportunities, it's access to networks. And I think what this free trade agreement brings, it brings that access because number one, as of the 1st of Jan, the agreement allowed for duty-free trading of goods and services. Now, what that does is that then stimulates job opportunities. It stimulates the economies. It ensures that as African countries, we are no longer working in silos. It also ensures that as young people, we have more access to other African markets, access to the sort of skills that we need to be able to participate in those labor markets. And we know from research that SMMEs are a key driver of creating employment. And the more free continental trade that we have, the better it is for SMMEs to be able to thrive within this environment. And the more jobs we'll see being created to help us to combat youth unemployment. So I'm incredibly excited about this agreement. And I'm excited to see just how strategic it will be in not only unifying Africa, but in solving this major unemployment crisis that we have.
Fantastic, thank you. I think one thing that I got from you would be, in terms of, I guess, managing that skills gap. Guyana, your perspective on this would also be appreciated. How do you think the government, young people themselves, and education can help solve this issue?
So I think it's important to understand that there are multiple players for us to be able to solve and to combat youth unemployment. I think too often responsibility is put on saying it's the government, but we have to understand that where we are now, we don't have a youth unemployment problem. We have a youth unemployment crisis. We're in the thick of the crisis, and this means that this is no longer business as usual. So it means government, it means corporates, it means us as youth, it means NGOs have to play a part. And I think where we can play a part in addressing the skills gap, and this is exactly the work that Guyana does so beautifully in Botswana, and I'm excited to hear him talk about that, but it's in providing access to information. Because all too often, we as young people don't understand what the career pathways are out there. We are limited to thinking the only way to be successful is to be a doctor or to be a lawyer. But there are so many other ways in which one can make a living. We need more young entrepreneurs in Africa. We need more social entrepreneurs who can not only create sustainable businesses, but also solve economic issues. So I think that, there has to be multi-stakeholder engagement, and a key factor to really closing these skills gaps is information. Because if young people understand what the labor market wants, they can upskill themselves with those skills accordingly. But I think the best person to take this answer further would be Guyana, because that's exactly the incredible work that he's doing in Botswana.
Way to put me on the spot, Farai. Thank you so much. This is an incredible opportunity, and I'm just really elated to hear about amazing young people and the different work that they do. More to your question, Bonolo, yes, addressing the skills gap. So particularly at Inspired Horizons, we actually created the NGO specifically to deal with this. It was done so that we can change the so-called narrative of academic excellence in a way that would really nurture, develop, and celebrate well-rounded, well-informed 21st century young leaders of value. And with that means we need to focus on making sure that we're improving access to quality education. Now, the quality education is one that's quite relevant, particularly right now to 21st century context, right? And again, to borrow what Farai was saying, we are dealing with a crisis here. The youth unemployment crisis particularly also stems from not just a lack of demand, job demand, but really we are having an issue where we're seeing a proliferation of tertiary institutions and therefore a proliferation of an increasing number of graduates, amazing, talented graduates. I think the biggest problem is that they don't have the necessary skills that currently the jobs are requiring. Now here we're talking about 21st century skills, innovation, entrepreneurial acumen, business acumen, thought leadership. And I think this is a key component, even in our education system, we actually don't have. We see so much focus on, let's say, the interpersonal, the soft skills, which are absolutely crucial, and evidently they're also missing. So what we do as part of the civil society organizations in Botswana is that we start now cultivating from grassroots level the essential skills that we feel like they need to be imported within the education system. And we really do that through community outreach programs. That's where now you start seeing that certain subjects, for instance, which I think we're going to be talking about and really exploring how young people can take full advantage of the free trade agreement. We start talking about agriculture, for instance, how then within the education system, we can commercialize agriculture as a subject to make sure that we see linkages from theory to practical, right? What are the missing gaps? As opposed to really now going to, let's say, business studies as a subject, why not have those essential entrepreneurial skills, those business acumen, financial literacy, why not have them in all the key components in all the subjects? So this is one of the things that we're actually now working with curriculum development to see how well we can foster those essential skills. So that's on the part of civil society engagement. And I think also there's an inclusion that's often missed, and unfortunately is missed by government. The lack of global synergies while we are actually creating all this so-called inclusive policies, right? We'll see that we have amazing policies that particularly look at, let's say, the revamp or the review of the education system, particularly the curriculum. But we don't actually include private sector and the private sector, parastatals, international organizations. These are also going to be our employers. And I think what's often missing is that if you don't include them at foundation level, if you don't make sure that in education we say the graduate profile, if you don't include them in the design of what actually a profile of a graduate will look like once you finish your studies, what kind of skills would you have, what kind of knowledge would you have? If you don't actually include them in the formation of that, then your anticipated outcomes are not going to match with what you would have liked, which is essentially making sure that this is seamless transition from somebody who is unemployed from somebody who's now finding a job, right? And I think these are some of the instances that were particularly missing. And this is some of the factors which are particularly instrumental in ensuring that we overcome this youth unemployment crisis.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kaine. To kind of build on what you've said, Londi, your industry is perhaps one of the main industries that people don't really have insight and information about, right? So let's assume then that in a perfect world, people have access to information and awareness about all of the industries and the opportunities that they have access to. What can civil society, governments, and grassroots organizations do to ensure that young people are engaging in these opportunities and with this information in a much more seamless way?
Bonolo, thank you. Thank you so much for this platform, Farai, Kaine, beautiful work. I'm glad that you asked this question actually to begin with, because to date, I still find the youth fascinated by what I do. Right, I even find most communities wanting me to call in more youth within the space, and it's always troubling to realize that even the decision makers in our governments also would have very little to say about our industry. So in this regard, I realized that there clearly is a lack of awareness. And if you imagine a young African girl, the instant a response to the ocean is that, oh, but I can't swim. You know, it's not natural for a Black child to say, okay, I would want to be a ship captain one day. It's not natural for a Black child to even try to find any interest in knowing what actually activities are being done on the ocean. So what I've realized with time is that with us trying to take over ocean's economy, there's a gap that we've allowed to grow much deeper, and that is a gap of awareness. So cultivating pure love for the ocean will then force the government to say, we need more kids playing in the space. So cultivating pure love for the ocean is what now I stand for with my foundation, Global Maritime Youth and the Black Mermaids, saying that just because there's no swimming pool at home doesn't mean that I would never know how to swim. And just because the Titanic had Jack and Rose and Peach people doesn't mean that you cannot tie it up with a Black person. So now where we stand as Africans is trying to role model what appealing opportunities are in the space. And we're speaking of small things, like if a child wants to be in the maritime space, who says they have to be a captain? So if a child, and you cultivate this entrepreneurial hunger that we see with the millennials and Generation Z, if you see someone who wants to be a makeup artist, instantly they imagine they can't do it on the ship. Cruise liners have makeup artists. If you see a DJ, you instantly think of the land. So where we are now is with the government having to shift their lenses to say, as much as we are fighting for the land, let's realize that the ocean belongs to us too. That way, when a child comes through and says, I want to be like Captain Sislondi, I want to be like Farai, then they will be well received. And so that's what we stand for now, to say, let's close this gap and let's shift our lens overall. And maybe, just maybe, we will realize that there's a bigger playground to play for the youth. And that is both the land and the ocean. That's where I stand at the moment with closing that gap. Bonolo, thanks for the question.
Fantastic, thank you. It'd be great to also get the audience's perspective on this. Shamiso, it'd be great if you could put out a poll asking, do you think, whose responsibility do you think it is essentially to empower young people and reduce youth unemployment? Do you think it's the government, the private sector, young people themselves, or civil society? It'd be great to get your perspectives, and we will go back to Shamiso at the end of the conversation to find out what the results are. Clearly, so far, education has proven to be a key part in addressing this issue. And there's a need clearly to diversify the type of education and knowledge that young people acquire. Jason, you're quite an avid champion for entrepreneurship being integrated into education and curriculum systems. Can you tell us why that's important for mobilizing the youth and preparing them with the necessary skills for operating in a single market economy?
Yeah, absolutely. Also, I just want to say it's an honor to be on this panel of so many great minds. So it's nice to kind of share the panel and listen. And I think I actually need to start with a few things that were mentioned. And I know Kaine touched on it a little bit. And I think it's fair for us to try to not reinvent the wheel. And I say that from the perspective of introducing entrepreneurship into education is something that I'm already seeing on the continent. One of the thought leaders that I sort of look very closely at is Fred Swaneker and the work that he's doing with the Africa Leadership Academy. And he's very much focused on creating, I believe it's about 3 million jobs or something like that, a massive amount of jobs by training a few million young people who come through his academy. And he basically sets the target that each of these kids who come through and graduate, they themselves will have a target of creating 300 jobs. And he embeds entrepreneurship within what they're studying. So if they're studying computer science, they need to be focused on, well, when I go back home, whether it's, I don't know, Zimbabwe, somewhere in South Africa, Congo, where I'm from, what am I really doing that I'm going to apply to my local community, which I can do at scale? And I think seeing things like this is already very valuable. So I think that's a great example of an institution on the continent that is already using that thinking. I think generally as well, the design of education is aged. And with COVID and the impact of COVID, I think it's also shown that remote learning and looking at organizations like Slum to School, which I believe started in Nigeria, is something that we can begin to model our education around. So just distance learning as well as sort of embedding entrepreneurship. I think me being an advocate for entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs, I have to say it comes from the fact that, and I think Farai mentioned it right at the beginning, entrepreneurs aren't only solving one problem. They're not just designing an organization to solve a problem, they're also contributing to a society in terms of jobs. So when we talk about youth unemployment, when I look across to a company like Paystack, albeit a fintech company, and seeing it exit at 200 million last year, which has been co-founded by two very young people, are creating hundreds of jobs for people across the continent, and I think even beyond. So when I look at entrepreneurship, I really look at it as a multiplier for not just solving problems commercially, but also contributing to alleviating this sort of youth unemployment crisis that we have going on. So I think it tackles a twofold problem, and I think it lies with government across the continent to continue to work on frameworks that allow startups to sort of play freely in sort of a sandpit. And I finally, just to close, I spoke to a young lady in Kenya building a neobank, who was telling me about sort of her concerns around building a neobank, and it was that she's playing in an area where there's not much regulation around. So at any point, her sort of operations could be shut down. And I think that is somewhere where government needs to work alongside startups, founders, business leaders to sort of tie into what Farai was saying, where it's a multi-stakeholder problem. It won't be solved by one area, but it really requires a lot of pulling and pushing and working together in order to allow us to tackle the problem of youth unemployment.
Thanks, Jason. That's been really incredible. I guess this next question, I would like to expand on one of the points that you made, that entrepreneurship, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, essentially. Solutions already exist. We just need to find ways to scale them. How do we make sure, though, that the example that you gave, Fred Swaneka's model, how do we make sure that that becomes the rule and not the exception? Because I guess the problem now is that, yes, those solutions exist, but there aren't necessarily the resources, the infrastructure, and the support for them to scale. So my question to you again would be, how do we make sure that those solutions are the rule and not the exception?
It's a great question. I think what comes to mind is a few years ago, I attended the LSE Africa Summit, and the big theme around it was designing solutions for Africans by Africans. And I think that really touches me when I sort of come back to the ALA, the Africa Leadership Academy model, because what Fred Swaneka and his team are recognizing is that we can't implement Western model, or we can't implement something that's coming from somewhere else here, and we can't even implement something that's coming from somewhere across the continent in maybe a South Africa or wherever. So I think with your question around exception versus the rule, I think ultimately, once you recognize how important it is to tailor problems to your environment, I think it will be very easy. And I think the second thing is, at the end of the day, this is data driven, right? So hopefully what we're seeing is jobs are being produced off the back of this sort of innovation. So I think so long as jobs are being produced off the back of this innovation, then there's no sort of debate to be had. So fingers crossed, because I think it's a great way to sort of apply a different way of thinking about a problem for an environment that's kind of unique to where you are.
Thank you. I would like to, which is a question that has actually come up from our Facebook stream, is how do we expand these opportunities, though, to people that do not have access to technology? Farai, I would love for you to kind of touch on this new project that the government has launched today, just to kind of give us a bit of insight on how, I guess, young people could expand the avenues that they use to find jobs and participate in the job market more widely.
Awesome, and thank you so much for the question. It really, really is an important one, and I think there's multiple approaches I can have to answering this, and I'll try to just segment it in my brain so it comes across very clearly to everyone. I think the first level to saying how do we provide those without access to phones with access to this information, the first way to answer that is that we do have a lot of grassroots organizations who are working with communities who don't necessarily have this access. One example of that is the work we do at the Africa Matters Initiative, whereby we host workshops, and this is pre-COVID. We're now definitely waiting for a lot of lockdowns to ease so we can continue our operations. But we host workshops with young people from communities that don't necessarily have access. And we've hosted such workshops across Nigeria, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia. And the power of that is that in hosting a workshop with a young person, and then hosting a workshop that they're not traditionally exposed to, you provide them with access, you provide them with skills, you broaden their horizons, and it then positions them much better to not only get more opportunities, but to also take what they've learned and impart that to the community they come from. So I'd say that's the first level in terms of how do we engage with those who don't have access. The second level I can use is what we do at the Youth Employment Service. Now, Yes for Youth provides unemployed young people with the 12-month work experience program to break the experience trap. And the experience trap is what a lot of young Africans find themselves in, where you can't get a job without work experience and you can't get work experience without a job. So what Yes does is to leverage funding from corporates to provide young people with this experience. And the beauty of this model is that a lot of corporates are not prescriptive in terms of where they want the impact to happen. And so because of that, Yes works with 35 partners on the ground who can go into Ratlo, which is an area in the Northwest, and train up unemployed youth as education assistants and have them working in schools. And when you have education assistants in schools, that frees up teachers with time to teach. Education assistants can mark exams, they can do the nitty-gritties, they can look at your attendance registers, then your teachers can teach, they can prepare for workshops and classes, they can ensure that their content is right. And we're seeing this beauty with these partners on the ground who go into these communities and provide young people with opportunities and access. The third layer, which links to an initiative that the president just launched about 2 hours ago, is the sayouth.mobi platform, which is a free, zero-rated platform across all South African networks for all unemployed youth, South African or not, to apply for learning and earning opportunities. And what's so exciting about this is that it centralizes opportunities because the costs of job seeking are incredibly high. You have to apply for this platform and that platform and that platform. And here presidency has said, no, let's centralize these opportunities. You apply in one spot, and wherever your skills are best suited to, you are linked to those opportunities. And I cannot wait to see how more young people sign up to this platform and how also even more corporates are applying to this platform. One other thing that's important to highlight, especially with the question looking at access, smartphones are a lifeline for the most poorest in society. And there's a study by the Pew Research Center in the US highlighting that for most poor Americans, smartphones are that lifeline because smartphones provide you with access. They provide you with connectivity. You get access and information to opportunities. And a major drive that we have to have on our continent, driven by government, driven by ICT sectors, is how do we ensure that as many Africans as possible have got access, have got smartphones? Because with these smartphones and having access, you've got access to opportunity and your life changes dramatically. So my call to those ICT companies on board now, any corporates, any NGOs, empower communities with access, because that's how we'll see us closing this gap and taking advantage of the Continental Free Trade Agreement.
Fantastic. I couldn't agree more with you, Farai. We've spoken a lot about what multiple stakeholders could do, and I guess I would love to move the conversation on to what the youth themselves can do for themselves. Gayane, in your TED Talk, you've spoken a lot about the concept of the ABC student, right? And I think your concept gives us great insight into how the young person themselves can be proactive about how they search for opportunities and how they themselves bridge that skills gap. Can you tell us a bit more about this concept and how you feel it could be helpful in mobilizing youth?
Absolutely. Sorry, I'm still infatuated with Farai's presentation. She's always just incredible to just to see. It's amazing work, Farai. I think when we come to the development of a well-rounded and particularly well-informed learner is this idea that when we are in school, we need to be proactive. So we need to go beyond the curriculum. And what's important about that is I'll share from example with one of the programs that we're doing that particularly aligns with the free trade agreement is on positioning a young person to really reap the benefits that will come with it, right? So right now, we are developing this training program that will essentially see a young learner or just a young person who have the ability to identify three main things. One being input. So what we're looking at is what can we do in terms of the home ground? What kind of goods, domestic goods and services can we really explore to make sure that young people, or particularly even with the SMEs as well, they can position themselves when we're exploring the value chains of, let's say, these big commodities and services, particularly for free trade agreement. Now, we know that a lot of, let's say, the disadvantages that most people will be talking about is that already we have big businesses and big companies that are going to infringe on, let's say, the development of this. For us, we are actually cultivating that proactiveness by saying, look, you don't always have to compete with the same product with an international multinational company. However, explore the domestic products. What is it at input level that you think you can have a competitive edge in? Well, for instance, what are some of the things that, particularly in Botswana, we have that are not necessarily being exported, yet they have the right qualities if they're honed right to be a leading export-led economy. For instance, the Senaparile, Moringa. So these are some of the fruits that are now being turned into oils and exploring even the value chains as well. So there's that aspect of where we are trying to make sure that young people that are engaging with Inspired Horizons Association, they look beyond the curriculum. They start now exploring the local communities and seeing what kind of domestic goods at input level they can hone in and actually trade in, right? So the second one is on capital financing, which largely, therefore, especially when you're looking at local communities, we know that we don't have access to capital. And for us, we really come in by, again, focusing on our strategic partners, but really ensuring that that you don't necessarily have to have financing to start a business, right? But what does that actually look like? And what are the necessary, let's say, policies and the frameworks and standard operating procedures that you need to make sure that they are okay in order for you to qualify for certain, financing and funding purposes. Again, that's looking into a more inquisitive and a proactive young person to explore really a different change, a mindset change from saying, look, I cannot start a business because I don't have the funding. Well, actually, no, you can. There's so many things that come into it, right? Do you have your papers? Do you have your research? And this is where now we really focus on making sure that in order for you to successfully start something, and this also looks at not just starting, but also maintenance, right? Being sustainable, that you have to be aware and be well informed of what that particular thing would entail. And then that's when now we start exploring on how you can access those funding reasons, right? Again, by looking at our strategic partners, both locally and internationally. And the third thing, again, which has been an overriding theme here, is the access to market. What's incredible about the free trade agreement is that it really has opened up. I think there was a study by the World Bank which was saying that actually intra-regional trades, where we're looking at trade amongst African member states, is actually at 2%. And the bulk of our trade is actually outside. And this is, in as much as we're saying that Africa is the youngest continent, but we're really looking at the fact that we do have a large amount of population that we actually will be our market. And this free trade agreement is now becoming the biggest, right? So the biggest trade bloc, in the world. And what this means to a young person is that you would have access to different markets. You don't necessarily have to think local. You don't necessarily have to think South Africa or Botswana. That you can actually now explore Nigeria. You can now explore Ghana. And that's what's beautiful about it. And I think again, here, where we are focusing is positioning a young person to make sure that they're aware that in as much as you are born in Botswana, that you are now actually become you're part of the global village. And therefore, what that actually means is ensuring that business persons actually understand the business trends, issues around cross-border requirements, the product regulations as well, and particularly even like intellectual properties, some of the things that we're exploring being the regulatory impact assessments, right, which becomes quite crucial in really making sure that we take full advantage of the benefits and that come with the free trade agreement.
Fantastic, Diana. Thank you. I'd like to expand a little bit on what you've just said. Sis Londi, in your TED Talk in particular, you have spoken about how ship ownership can be an incredible tool for youth employment. And in many ways, it can be a tool that addresses some of the challenges that Diana has just mentioned, right? So I'd love for you to kind of give us a bit more insight into that and let us know how you feel that ship ownership and kind of more engagement in the maritime industry can mobilize young people across the border.
Thanks, Bonolo. I'm just fascinated at how everything just ties up in the end, even though we're in different fields and different backgrounds and streams. I'm just fascinated witnessing what Kayane just said now. Zooming into the oceans economy, right now, we have more interest in the coastal and marine tourism. And this emanates from the deficits of ship ownership in South Africa and Africa at large. Why is this? We do have tonnage, but we lack governance in the movement of our tonnage. And by tonnage, I mean just goods, right? So what would happen is a lady in the textile industry would move her fabrics to China. So that 1,000 gross tonnage that she moves, she would obviously use the bigger shipping companies, the big players, and then maybe let's move to a guy in Cape Town with wine and wanting to move his wine to Germany. So the same concept, that person is wanting to use the bigger players, that's the international shipping companies. If I have cabbages here in South Africa and I need to share these with yet Singapore, I'll be using the big players. So what happens is governance of tonnage here lacks. And that is why we cannot have our own ships. So if this, surely, as you know, we can afford ships. Buying a ship won't be a problem. The problem is sustaining the movement of these goods. And that's what the agreement seeks to achieve now, to say, let's not maybe look at the wider margins like the international markets and see if we can play in the space ourselves. So then we're moving into trying to control and have more control with the movement of our goods and have more controls within our waters. I'll make an example. Durban, South Africa is the busiest harbor. But essentially what happens is it's international ships coming in and out. You won't find a single African-owned ship coming into Durban. Again, Kenya is the second largest. But you will find us Africans playing the movement of goods and letting all these ships come in and out. So why can't we own ship? It will take me to say, Mr. So-and-so in the mines, give me 10,000 gross tonnage of your goods per year. And trust me, I'll take good care of them and make sure that they get to the next, to your consignee. Again, if you have your smartphones, trust me that I can use my shipping company to move your goods to your consignee. That way we can clean up tonnage, and that way we can be able to own our ship and track a sustainable movement of goods. So now, the reason why we have more interest in the coastal and marine tourism is because we will be able to have a little bit of authority in saying we have leisure resources that we can offer to the international market. So I can move from South Africa to Mozambique. If I move from South Africa to Mozambique by boat or by super yacht, I can be able to feed into the African economy into the Mozambique into the Mozambican economy, so to speak. And we're talking here wedding venues, we're talking here restaurants, so that we can be able now to allow more youth to play into the space. But where we're playing, we're not playing on land, we're playing on the oceans, but we've got much more authority, which means even the crew within our boats can be only South African. Right now, lots of kids sit at home with my qualification, but we're waiting for shipping companies internationally to dictate how many they can take or whether or not they want to use them. So it is a crisis. And I think that what you mentioned now, I saw Kayene also mentioned the 2%, and I just remembered that actually the female participation in our industry is only 2%. So if we can have more control, we can control so much of this crisis. And it starts with ship ownership. And I've just tried to put it in layman's terms possible to say, if you have someone who creates or rather produces raw material, where are they shipping those goods? And can you hold them accountable to say, let them play within the African shipping companies? And maybe, just maybe, we can have more ships and be able to hold our oceans economy and be accountable to the youth that we empower.
Fantastic. I would love to ask you, how do you think, though, given, I guess, climate change is a big issue in the world, right? We need to develop solutions that take care of both people and planet. And my question to you would be, how do we create ship ownership, marine tourism, and I guess grow the ocean's economy without compromising sustainability? But before you touch on that, one question I would love to ask Farai that you touched on briefly is the gender disparities, right? So what, Farai, in your experience, are some of the challenges that women face in the workplace? And what are some of the solutions that are required for addressing these gender disparities?
Sure. Thanks so much for the question. I can definitely write a thesis on this. I have for my master's. So there's a lot of issues women face in the workplace, particularly Black women who work in organizations or companies where they are within the minority. This ranges from things like your industries, which are male dominated, like Sis Lundi has said, her industry has only 2% women. This also ranges from issues like the organizational culture. It can be very, very traditionally male. So decisions are often made on the golf course after having a beer, not actually including women into this conversation. Other issues could be also the fact that when organizations are not transformed, Black women find themselves having dual responsibilities. One, not only meeting the targets of the organization, but two, also having to be that transformation candidate, to be that voice of diversity. So there's so many issues which face women in companies. They face Black women, particularly in different organizations. From the African continent, while we've made a lot of advances in gender equality, with us having, for example, in Rwanda, the highest level of political representation of women in the world, we've made such significant advances, but we still have a long way to go in terms of how we actually achieve real equality and how we ensure that women in the workplace are just as valued as men are. And there are so many suggestions we can make towards this, but just off the top of my head, things like some policy changes are absolutely important. So how do you make equality a key feature within your policy? South Africa's got the Employment Equity Act and our BEE legislation. Things like changing company culture. So having diversity experts in to deal with the company culture, because there's a lot of bias in companies that not many people are aware of. And I think things like having conversations with your colleagues and your employees about sharing experiences, and especially as we engage more more with each other as Africans. From a trade perspective, we'll be doing more business with one another. And of course, culture comes into play, gender comes into play. So how do we navigate these? And it's important that we start having these open conversations to get it right. So there's definitely, I think, so many layers to answer this question. But I think to summarize, there are many challenges, but there's many ways to fix them. And I think we are a continent that's full of innovation. We're a continent that's full of young people. We are also a continent that is incredibly diverse. I mean, we talk of men and women, but we're not talking of the LGBT community. So there's just so much that I think as a continent we need to unpack. But my hope is that as we continue to trade with one another, as we continue to really overcome these boundaries which have been set with us politically, we can create a culture as a continent that is inclusive, and one where, regardless of what your gender identity or sexuality is, you walk through the workplace being acknowledged and accepted and embraced.
Fantastic. I love that, Farai. Thank you so much. Sis Londi, continue, please.
I just want to echo, and maybe just add on what Farai has said. You know, the 2% participation in my industry, unfortunately, it's just one of those where you feel like it's some of the movements that we do is just like yet another movement. But, you know, in my industry, it's a matter of we tend to pop babies every now and again. And so we don't seem appealing to the human resource KPI for KPIs for the year. You know, if I then fall pregnant, I'm kicked out of the ship completely. And I may not come back for maybe a year or so because I have to be away, and there's no, I won't get immediate help on board the ship. But I also feel like, again, from my point of view, women can dress a certain way on the ship. Even if I'm off duty, I cannot wear a sleeveless top, so to speak. So then we moved to the International Maritime Organization in 2019, which came up with the 2% stats. And we were all just shocked because me sitting here as the only female amongst 40-something males, I'm thinking, surely there's 5 other girls somewhere, there's 2 other girls somewhere. Meanwhile, globally, there's only 2% participating. So we came up with the International Maritime Organization theme in 2018 when they came out and say, hashtag I am on board with gender equity. And it went viral on social media. Every man stood with a board on the ships saying, I am on board with gender equity, I am on board. And then you put this on the land side and we do a lot of movement, stop this, I stand for this. The question here is, who holds these movements accountable? Who holds decision makers accountable? As we speak now, it's been 2019 since that was shared. We're in 2021, we're still sitting at 2%. So movements become just movements. Movements become just a tick box exercise. I say, even with the Continental Free Trade Agreement, who holds accountable a female participation, youth participation, and are the numbers actually growing or they're just stagnant? So I think that just to add on to Farai, where she says problems can be solved, this can solve a lot of problems. Say after a movement, can we have it in black and white that the numbers of female participations are actually rising?
Thank you, Londi. And I think I appreciate what both you and Farai said, because I think this conversation helps us realize that there is no single issue cause, right? And that while the Continental Agreement will change so much, it's just the beginning, it's not the end. But we also need to make sure that not just the solutions that come up, but also the implementation mechanisms of this agreement are much stronger, right? Because we don't want to end up in a situation, like you said, where people make promises and then 10 years down the line, we're still in the same place. Jason, I would love your perspective, actually. I want to understand what are some of the things that you think both government and private sector can do to ensure that young people are actively engaged and that they have access to finance and productions and networks to ensure that their participation in this free market economy is sustained in the long term?
Yeah, sure, I can answer that. I think going back to the discussion on female participation, I think obviously you don't need a male voice on this, but as an ally to the problem that we have, I don't think it's fair to just skip over into. So I think just to touch on that a little bit, I think much of what we're experiencing now is obviously a result of roles in the past having been designed around men, and as was discussed by Farai and Captain, that the golf course sort of thing where there's no female inclusion, so therefore we're designing workplaces and things all on the basis of women. So I think there's much to be done there, and I think at the moment there's a reshaping going on very slowly. And I say all of this to say is that something that I mentioned when I first spoke was data, and ultimately at the end of the day, the accountability comes from, can we see numbers on female participation? Can we see numbers on young people being positively affected by this trade agreement? So I think at the end of the day, those are things that are really going to show whether we are speaking or whether we're doing, and I think that's super important. And I think to your question on sort of participation with the private sector and government, I genuinely believe it goes hand in hand. So what the organization that I'm building is called Pamoja Network, and Pamoja is Swahili for together. And what we're really trying to do is connect talent to startups on the continent. So as I mentioned before, I was speaking to a young female founder in Kenya and just trying to understand what kind of business problem she's struggling with. Because what I'm trying to do is connect the talent in the private sector globally and in and around the continent to help solve some of the problems that young startups are facing but can't afford to outsource at a young stage in their development. So I think that is a small example of how the two sort of go hand in hand. I'm seeing a lot of sort of government-driven programs. I'm seeing Africa Development Bank rolling out Jobs for Youth programs, which are in partnership with companies like MasterCard Foundation and loads of other organizations. So again, I think it keeps coming back to the discussion of a multi-stakeholder approach to a single problem. And I think that is actually, in my opinion, the only way sustainably that something will be done, if everyone sees the value in solving a particular problem. Otherwise, it will just be a continuous talking point. There needs to be value seen in solving a problem and a togetherness around it.
Thank you, Jason. And one of the ways you mentioned earlier in terms of driving this value, like you said, when it came to addressing gender disparities with data. But as Londi mentioned, the data has always been there, right? It's the accountability that matters. Guyana, it'd be great to get your perspective on how you feel that we can, move beyond the data, right? Because like Londi said, 2 years ago, the maritime industry was still at 2%. We're now in 2021, it's still in 2%. What are the things that need to happen to make sure that those numbers aren't just, arbitrary and they're just not, trinkets on the Christmas tree, but they're actually things that mobilize action? What do you think needs to happen?
Thank you for that. And I think as I speak on behalf, and I'm sure Farah here will back me up, particularly as civil society organizations, we are growth partners, right? And we are solution creators. And I think what's important about this is we actually use the status quo to inform our programming. And by seeing, by seeing all this disconnects and the inequalities, particularly structural inequalities, that becomes an instrumental part in informing how we should be tailoring our programming. As I work within the development space, particularly also within the international development space, I can speak from the capacity of, let's say, GIZ, which is the German Development Corporation, of which I'm a technical consultant on, particularly on issues of COVID-19, right? And what has been important is that at the conception stage, where COVID-19, it was still, we hadn't experienced the death rates and so on, but now we're talking about what are some of the preventive measures that we need to develop. We used the data and actually try to analyze and even identify the kind of stakeholders that will be instrumental in offering solutions towards, let's say, towards the preventive measures of COVID-19. In particular, even just about, your treatment, the sanitizers and the masks and so on. What we then did is that we coordinated efforts and built on the existing national and regional linkages, like for instance the SADC region, right, to ensure that the different countries now, they can have a centralized framework where it's easier to identify which companies can focus on what and which other companies can do what. And I think what that has been able to do is that has been able to really fast track in terms of our interventions, particularly within the SADC region on COVID-19, right? With South Africa being a key industry player. I use that as an example to then bring it back to, this is some of the interventions or some of the mechanics that we can also, use whilst addressing, the structural inequalities and particularly the low numbers that have been recorded in women participation, youth participation, and even the lack of inclusion and diversity in some of the work. Right, making sure that we're quite intentional in our representation, and being intentional in our representation is actually including, Africa Matters as well, including Inspired Horizons in the formation, in the design of policies, in the design of gender-responsive policies. We're also working with, the Young Mothers, so we have Young Mother Support Network. And what's there that we're currently doing is we're making sure that we're positioning the young mothers in actually national technical working groups. So whenever we're designing at a policy level, any policies or legal frameworks that will particularly directly affect young mothers, we make sure that we engage and make sure that we're positioning representation from the young mothers themselves to speak on issues of adolescent girls and young women, to speak on issues of lived experiences, to speak on issues of what structural unemployment can do, to speak on issues of what systemic poverty can do. And this is important because it then allows for the tailoring of really context-specific policies. And by ensuring that context-specific policies are made, it's easier for you to have an implementation plan that will actually be efficient, effective, and much more inclusive, right? So I think these are just some of the things by making sure that we're intentional in really ensuring that those people most affected are represented, not just being spoken for, but they're actually actively participating, right? That would go a long way in ensuring that, one, the design of the policy in itself is inclusive, two, the implementation guidelines and the frameworks is easier to disseminate, and most importantly, accountability. The accountability structures themselves that are reinforced, making sure that both exit and voice mechanisms are there, because on voice is to ensure that if something is not done right, we have an easier outlet that's quite easy for people to access, particularly those affected, to say this is not going right, therefore let's, you're voicing out that opinion. So the voice mechanism needs to be there, but as well as the exit mechanisms as well. If we're seeing injustice, if we're seeing that, inefficiencies, and we know that there's somebody directly responsible for that, because we are part of the decision-making processes, right? It will be a lot easier to make sure that they exit so that we pave way for a much more efficient and effective system. So I think these are some of the ways that we can really ensure that we're much more intentional in our responses.
I love your Young Mothers program, Gaine. I think in many ways it shows, as this pandemic has revealed, that the private is political. A lot of women have lost their jobs during this period, not necessarily due to incompetence or a lack of skills, but as you've mentioned, because they have childcare needs. And I think this moves on well to my next point, right? Which is, I guess, the unemployment question isn't just a question that can be applied wholly to everybody on the continent. It's also a class issue, right? And across classes, the access to the job market and opportunities is quite stark, to say the least. What I would like to ask our panelists, and I will start with you, Farai, is what do we do for the young people that are left behind? Because as Sis Londi mentioned earlier, there are young people with the exact same qualifications that she has that are set at home. Those young people in 5 years' time, when it comes to entering the job market, will have It's not just a skills deficit, but their knowledge will be dated, right? So that means that the young people that will be graduating at the time that they're trying to enter the job market will inevitably surpass them. And also it means that middle and upper class children will always, I guess, have a leg up. So I would love to hear from you, Farai, and then we can move on to Jason. What do you think we can do for the young people that are left behind?
Thanks so much, Monola. I think that's a really important question. And it's something we see at YES every day. If you look at so just for context, the Youth Employment Service has created over 55,000 job opportunities. From those job opportunities that we've created for unemployed youth, if I'm not mistaken, less than 10% have got diplomas and degrees. Majority of YES youth are young people who either dropped out of high school because they had to tend to family responsibilities, or were just able to get their matric qualification and nothing else. And for a long time have been excluded from the formal economy until such a program came about, which afforded them an opportunity to do a 12 months work experience opportunity. And I think I definitely agree with you that if you just look at the recent employment stats that came out in South Africa, the expanded definition of youth unemployment is at about 74-75%. If we take graduate unemployment from that pool of youth unemployment, it's also less than 10%. So if you are privileged, or if you can afford to apply for a bursary successfully, then you're more or less sorted. And I think what's even more fascinating about the graduate unemployment rate in South Africa is that it remains consistent. And what that shows us is that even if you as a graduate are unemployed for about a year, your chances of finding something are very likely. And then there's a new pool of graduates who come in and they are unemployed. So those are what those stats are showing us. And in terms of those who are left behind, I think that's where the focus needs to be. So I'm a firm believer, I struggle on panels that only want to talk about graduate unemployment. I say, yes, that's important, but the bulk of the unemployment issue is not your graduates. It's people who just have a grade 12 or people who don't even have a grade 12. Now, how do we encourage them to be within the formal economy? And that means we have to create employment opportunities, because those are the youth that often find themselves in this experience trap, where they can't get a job because they don't have work experience, and they can't get work experience because they don't have a job. And I think to ensure that those groups of youth are not left behind, we have to create access to opportunities, and we have to remove barriers to those opportunities. And this means having access to work experience opportunities and not having any conditions to a youth participating in that. This means corporates as well have to relook a lot of the interventions that they have, because corporates have great interventions, but they're often just focused on your graduates. And what about those who have got the potential and the skills, but just haven't been able to continue with their studies? So on a corporate level, on a government level, and on an NGO level, they have to be targeted programs, and Gaine's approach about context-specific programs definitely comes into play here. I want to quickly share a story about my experience at YES. So I grew up in a privileged background. My dad is a medical doctor. My mom has had extensive experience in the ICT space. I managed to get into really good universities. I managed to get a bursary for my master's. So my life has been pretty well set. And I'm 26 now. Because of the opportunities I've had, I'm able to serve in a senior management role at work. Yet there's youth who I'm meeting at work, who are working within the teams I'm in, who are 26, 27, 28, and it's their first job. And yet they've got so much potential. They are so great. They want to learn. If you teach them skills, they gain it quickly. And the only difference is that life has been unfair to them on a socioeconomic level. And that is something we see every day. There are so many young people that have potential to thrive, who have just been discounted simply based on where they were born and which family they were born to. And it's important that we can empower young people with as many skills and opportunities as possible so that they don't get left behind. We need to create as many opportunities, because I think one of the things we don't want as a continent is for our youth boom to be an economic burden. And economists are calling it that, because without skills and education and opportunities for employment, it's an economic burden. So we have to make it an economic opportunity, and this means investing in young people and ensuring no one is being left behind.
I love the concept of it being an economic burden for I. Jason?
Yeah, I think you touch on so many points. For I think it's bleak. Unfortunately, when we do look at numbers, we see, as you were saying, 10 to 12 million young people are joining the labor force market each year, when there's only about 3 million jobs being produced. So there's about 2/3 of shortage that we're seeing. I think moving away from the problems that we all understand, I think that there are ways to kind of get around this problem. Here in the UK, one thing that I've seen is that Ernst Young, the accountancy firm, has removed the need to have a university degree to be able to come into the company. Now, whilst this is a small thing, it really tackles the problem of class as well, because there are many young people who might not have the opportunity to go to university because they don't have, for a multitude of reasons. So I think, that being said, and me personally telling a sort of personal anecdote, for the most part, there's not a job that I've gone into that I've been able to do the job at 100%. I've gone into the role and I've learned about the role. So removing sort of the degree aspect, I think, is super important to allow opportunities to be more accessible. So sometimes it's things as simple as that, and people a little bit higher up in the organization looking at things a bit differently. Because when it comes to entrepreneurship as well, I do not believe that I genuinely believe that entrepreneurs are meant to be doing a civil good to society as well. Thinking about shaping what is it that I'm doing here, okay, commercially, but beyond that, sort of a conscious capitalism aspect to the work that they're doing. And I think, not to make this long-winded, I think lastly, the question that sort of bubbles around in my head is, I think it's a matter of, what are we considering to be our problems? So if this, what we're talking about, youth unemployment, is not our problem, when will it be? And I think this is a question of not just solutions. It's a question of values and foresight and integrity and looking at others around you. So I think sometimes this, whilst we can speak quite broadly about solutions and problems, I think sometimes it does come to a place of, you can come from a privileged background, as you said, Farai, but are you willing to look at your privilege in the mirror and say, hey, I'm going to leverage my expertise to support my wider community?
Thank you, Jason. I'm just a bit conscious of time. So Shamiso, can I ask you for some questions from the audience quickly before we wrap up? Sorry, we can't hear you, Shamiso.
My apologies. I was just saying, Bonolo, and to the rest of the panelists, that before we go to the questions, I'd just like to highlight the fact that Brand South Africa, in collaboration with the Department of Trade, worked on a research project where we did a lot of research on what is called the social economy. And that the research that we did now has actually contributed to the green paper that is presently before Parliament. And the basis of that green paper is that we discovered that a lot of young people are engaged in a lot of social entrepreneurship initiatives, and that there isn't a lot of structural support, particularly from government. So that paper will ensure that government, not only government structures, but legislation is put in place to be able to ensure that our young people, particularly those involved in the NPO and social enterprise sector, have the necessary support. So that's definitely something to look forward to, and we hope that that type of legislation will start a ripple effect across the continent, where more and more African governments can adopt such policy to support their young people. We have a question from Kauleza, and his question is to Captain Londi, and he asks, what plans does her department have in ensuring that children are aware of the opportunities for them to get into maritime?
Thank you so much for the question. So the Department of Transport has incubation programs a variety of incubation programs. And they also have institutions that they support that drive the curriculum in our industry. Particularly, you speak of SAIMI, the South African Institute of Maritime. So SAIMI has a lot of programs that they feed to different kinds of communities, and they would market and advertise this on their websites. Some of them will show on their Facebook. We also have Sail Africa. Sail Africa was founded by Jackie Cameron, and she's in Durban, and she takes kids and puts them on boats. I personally drive the Global Maritime Youth. I feed into the supply and demand of the industry itself. And what I stand for is that not every child wants to be a captain. We've got a lot of entrepreneurial hunger that we need to feed into, and we need to be open to that beyond the curriculum. And we've seen amazing things being done. I said on the 1,000 Ocean Startups that's supported by Sir Richard Branson. And you'll see kids playing with plastics. And there's a woman that made a seaweed burger. So we just want to open that beyond the curriculum. But most importantly, and I actually wanted to add to this, Bonolo, it's our role to make sure that we multiply. I personally was able to walk the ranks and became a ship captain. And it's my role to say to that young child, there's more to my industry. And when I walk on the streets and the kids want to touch my epaulets, absolutely. They see my afro, absolutely. So it's role modeling the industry. And you will see more programs, I forgot the name, sorry. You'll see more programs being implemented for kids to be able to learn how to swim, for kids to know to go on boats and actually feel whether or not they get seasick. You'll see there's another lady called the Black Mermaid. She teaches kids how to dive. So it's different kinds of programs and incubation programs that have been approved for different kinds of entrepreneurs and business owners to implement and roll out to the community.
Thank you for that, Captain Londi. Our second question is from Usibusiso, and his question is actually quite pertinent, and I'm sure that a lot of us can agree that as the youth, this is something that we are particularly concerned about. He says that, how do we as youth navigate in such a challenging political environment where our interests seem to be a non-priority to across the continent?
Yeah. Can I speak to this one? I think it's a difficult one, to be honest, Spusisa. I think youth have repeatedly said, and I know this is a sentiment that Guyana shares, that we are asked to sit in boardrooms. We are asked to give our insight on green papers. We are asked to kind of give our perspectives on research. We are invited to galas and dinners and conferences for leadership to hear our perspectives. I think what we need to problematize is that whole idea of having a seat around the table, because what we need to question is who created the table in the first place and who gets to decide who sits around it. I think the one thing that youth can do, and unfortunately this isn't always in our control, is actively participate in decision-making processes. That has to be a thing for our continent. And we have to create spaces for younger leaders to come into decision-making roles. Namibia has been great in showing this. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that a young person comes straight out of university and they're a minister, right? There has to be progress to that happening. But I don't think young people can wait until they're 45 or 50 to become that, right? Because I think what this panel has shown, and quite a lot of the research and the work that our panelists do, is that there are young people who have skills, who have knowledge, who have insight. The problem is there is just, I guess, there is a lack and there is a resistance to giving them the power that is necessary to transform our continent.
Thank you, Bonolo. We have another question, and it is from South Africa's ambassador to Ireland. And she says, what, and this is a question to all the panelists, What can we do to shift the mindset of our youth towards self-employment, including entrepreneurship, especially in those uncommon spaces, to be able to persuade and enable them to embrace being job creators rather than job seekers?
I think, yeah, if I may, I think I have a friend. His name is Insako, and he works. And we connected a while ago, and he works on an organization in the townships of Cape Town, which is low cost security. And his kind of thing, how he kind of came across that was, it wasn't just from seeing the problem, but I think it was from being in and around sort of the essence of entrepreneurship in an education setting. So I guess to answer your question directly, I think in order to do that, I think it needs to be pushed into thinking that way. And most of the time we go to school, hopefully, to learn how to critically think. So if you can start to embed that in the institutions that we go to, where we're meant to be sort of studying and getting particular grades, and starting that ideology around, okay, what kind of business solutions or social entrepreneurship solutions would you do in and around your local community, how to gather data, how to speak to people, all of these kind of things. I think it will bear fruit. But I think it really begins from the same things that I think was mentioned by, I think it was yourself, Kayane, where it's like you learn about financial literacy, you could learn about financial literacy, all of these kind of things at school. It's the same concept. Include entrepreneurship as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, oops. You can go ahead, Kiana.
Sorry, I was going to say, yeah, absolutely. I think, I was seeing one of the comments, I was speaking on vocational training, and it actually reminded me of my TEDx talk in Germany when I was speaking about the ABC student, right? And essentially what I was talking about is that for the critical thinker, the proactive student, right? It's important also to even look at the fact that not everybody is academically intelligent in the space of, let's say, academics or the theoretical application that we're seeing in schools. You have amazing, you have amazing students or amazing people who are doing design and technology. And unfortunately, that's the only thing that they will excel at. And then anything else, they seem to fail. But because of the way our education system is structured, the way we see them as failures and so on, right? And I was saying that it would be great to even look at countries like Germany, where vocational training institutions, there's something that are quite celebrated, but not only celebrated, they're not seen as second tier, right? They're actually amongst, top leading institutions that recognize as top leading institutions and, nationally. And this is, I think in Africa, this is almost like the flip side, where vocational training is like, oh, because you failed, therefore go and do design and technology, or go and do plumbing, and go into electricity. So it's almost being like, wow, this is what you're left with, unfortunately, right? And I think if we keep changing, if we change that dynamic and we change that mindset and really look at intentional promotion of vocational training, we start seeing now, even somebody who unfortunately couldn't graduate from year 12, they're now able to have a platform where they know that the skill set that they have is actually important, is actually celebrated at a national level, and that becomes priority at a national development planning, right? Then second to that is also ensuring that we have skills training and capacity building for the young people to make sure that they have the necessary skills to hone on what already they have innately. And I think by focusing on capacity building, we're also looking at the community itself as well, to see that we're creating this thriving ecosystem where a young person's ability that nurtured, the young person's talents are developed, but also you have the community themselves in order to embrace you, in order to make sure that they understand that plumbing, you can actually make something out of plumbing. What's interesting again about Germany, the powerhouse of the European Union, is that now they have a competitive edge in manufacturing. And now we're talking about manufacturing here in Africa. But then the bulk of the technical expertise, the bulk of the skill set is actually from vocational training institutions. So it's interesting how now we're trying to catch up to the rest of the world, but we've already had these institutions, we've already had these amazing young people. It's just that they continue to be marginalized and they continue to be underrepresented where it really matters most. And lastly, I would say is institutional support. We have to make sure that we look at the institutions that are quite important, that are quite significant in really shaping the economy of our country. We have to make sure that they're also intentional in extending and advancing support to young people and really recognizing that talent is important, but diverse talent also deserves recognition. That is not only about somebody who's theoretically smart, but now somebody who can excel and really, change the world fundamentally by, app development, by innovation, by plumbing, manufacturing, you name it, carpentry, and so on. So if we really do find a perfect marriage of promoting a culture of recognizing talents in the diverse forms, we can also, insofar as look at the skills training capacity building institutions, which are the vocational training institutions, and trying to equip them and now even invest more in them because they're quite crucial, particularly for 21st century world. And also lastly, by really making sure that in terms of the other stakeholders, relevant stakeholders in really shaping a thriving ecosystem, they are also intentional in extending institutional support as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kayane. Thank you, Shamis, for your support with all the questions. I am now going to wrap up this conversation, and I would love to thank the panelists for your time and your generosity and your knowledge. This has really been an eye-opening experience for me, and I'm sure for all of you. I would love to invite Pumela back onto stage to close up the conversation. Thank you all again.
Hi, my name is Raylene Rourke. I'm ex-Miss Teen South Africa, a World Economic Forum global shaper, and founder of Spring Age. What does Youth Month mean to us? It means it's a time for us to reflect on the power and the potential that young people have. It's about getting involved, it's about participating and really playing your part. My advice to young people is, guys, the power of reflection and really thinking. Spending the time to think about your goals, spending the time to think about your dreams, and really reflecting and thinking critically about where we're going. Focus on the things you need to do, present in where we are. We live in amazing times with amazing opportunities. Let's try and get them, but do it in a focused, reflective, present way. What does it mean to be young? Well, for me, it means being unreasonable, having unreasonable, bold, futuristic ideas, and actually having the energy to try them.
Youth, our future, who are not only visionaries, but they are runners as well. As from what you have seen, they also have their own initiatives. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking the team of speakers for leading the conversation of the youth, for the youth, by the youth. They are not only talkers, but they are also doers, as you have seen. Thank you, Shamiso Hlachwayo. Thank you, Tandom Ketu. Thank you, Kayeni Disepo. Thank you, Jason Kitenge. Thank you, Farai Mubawa. Thank you, Captain Londiwe Ngobo. Thank you to our moderator, Bunolo Madibe. The Africa report, ladies and gentlemen, mentions that 1 million unemployed youth enter the labor market on a monthly basis. So the Africa Continental Free Trade Area has the potential to produce more jobs for the estimated 30 million African youth who will be entering the job market each year after the year 2030. So the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, if implemented correctly, will no doubt transform the African continent. So in conclusion, join me in reading a poem from a global South African in the United Kingdom. He penned this poem during this session, during this webinar session. He was so inspired by the youth. Although he is no longer within the youth bracket, he was so inspired, and his name is Eugene Skiev. And this is the poem. Meditation for the youth of the Soweto uprising. The pupa carries the silken wings of the butterfly. Meditate on the gift of permanence that comes from the sacrifice. Thank you for joining us, ladies and gentlemen, on Zoom, on YouTube, on Facebook. That was a poem dedicated to the youth of this continent and the rest of the world by a global South African in the United Kingdom, Eugene Skiev. Thank you for joining us on this Youth Day. Happy Youth Day, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Do you know what it really means to be brave? I can tell you. It takes heart and a people who, after failing once, twice, many times, to stop, get up, and try again. It takes a leader who says, we will rise from the ashes and try again. Who put his people, their freedom, and the country's democracy first. What does it mean to be brave? It means being open to opportunities and overcoming the fear of exposure. It's brave to focus on more than just the tangible. Bravery is not about shouting loudly and making bold moves. It's about continuity. To prove time and again that we have what it takes, that we're a force to be reckoned with. But it's not enough to only acknowledge our faults. We have to be brave enough to intentionally address them.
This is the year in which we will turn the tide on corruption.
Because it takes bravery to keep going, to keep growing. It takes bravery to take a stand in the midst of a revolution, to take a leap of faith in a climate of opportunity, and stand at the ready for what the future might bring. To welcome those who push the boundaries, and being open to the unknown, because it takes bravery to realize potential. What I'm trying to say is that it's bravery that makes all the difference. Invest in South Africa, the brave future.